One of the other reasons why marriages between foreigners and Japanese or Korean women can break down is communication problems that are caused by a major cultural difference between the two cultures. I made another video where I was talking about the fact that foreigners often do not realize how formidable Japanese and Korean women are when they become wives or especially when they become mothers. And that is an extreme disconnect between expectation and reality, which is a big reason why some of these marriages break down. But another really big reason is a communication style difference, which is quite extreme. And I think it's difficult for especially Americans to understand how big this cultural gap actually is. So, in both Japanese and Korean culture, you're expected to figure out what's going on in almost any context without being told explicitly what's happening. In Korean culture, they call this Nunchi, and in Japanese culture, they call it kuki wo yomeru. Literally, that translates to reading the air in Japanese. And it is not just something that you do once in a while in a certain situation or context. Like in the US, we might say, oh, this guy failed to read the room. This is something that you do 24/7 all the time in all situations, even when you're alone. There's a certain amount of mental energy that's always devoted to calculating the whole situation, all the people around you, what the context is, what they're expecting, what they are thinking, what they want. And you have to take that into account with almost everything that you do or say. Now, that sounds like a lot of work, but it is just a natural thing that almost everyone does in these cultures. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily better. There are a lot of great things about this, and there are negative things. It can be quite oppressive, and it's one of the reasons peer pressure in these cultures can be so heavy. But regardless of any value judgments, the gap between the way most Americans are and the way most people are in these other cultures is so large in this dimension that it is hard to even conceive of. Now, as I've said before, I'm Japanese American. My parents are Japanese, and I absorbed this from my Japanese parents, even though I grew up in the United States. But it wasn't only until later in my life that I realized how different my family is from most American families, because I started noticing that I would leave a lot of things out. I would leave out details that I thought were kind of obvious. And a lot of Americans would not pick up on it. And this only became kind of an issue when I joined the workforce and I noticed, my colleagues or even people I'm supervising or whatever weren't getting what I'm talking about because they weren't doing those extra steps of extrapolation, which I just think of as normal or expected. Now, in a relationship, your Korean or Japanese wife is going to expect you to do this. And especially if you're a typical American, you're likely to miss a lot of the cues that they think they're giving to you, which they think are totally obvious. So sometimes you see these really sad stories of like an American guy who said that their wife suddenly disappeared with the kids. It was a complete shock. They've ghosted him. He can't even find them, etc. What I think is happening there, and I'm just speculating, but I suspect what happened is this woman thought that the husband was just completely clueless, was not picking up on all of her signals and so on, and eventually just decided I'm going to give up and I'm taking the kids and leaving because I don't want to deal with this anymore. And the guy is completely blindsided because he was not picking up on these signals that she thought were completely obvious. If I were to give kind of like an intuitive estimate of the difference between the level with which most Koreans and Japanese do this in their everyday life, it would be like 100 to 1 compared to, I mean, Americans, of course, pick up on some context, right? It's not like Americans have no notion of social context. Of course, every culture has a notion of that. But I would say like the scale is like 100 to 1 difference, something like that, especially with Japanese. I mean, Koreans are a little bit more explicit than Japanese, which I actually kind of admire about Korean culture, but it's still very indirect. I don't really think it's possible for you to pick up on these habits in the way that someone who grew up in the culture has, because it just as it's impossible for me to really drop this habit. I grew up with it, and so it's just built into my psyche that I think this way, and I think other people think this way. And even though I intellectually know that in the United States, people generally don't obsess about these things nearly as much as Japanese do, it still surprises me all the time when I realize I've left out something that I thought was obvious, and this other person didn't pick up on it. When I'm in Korea or Japan, I feel a kind of relief because I know that other people are picking up on this stuff. And the odd thing is, like, my Korean and Japanese language skills are not great, but even when I'm not saying anything and just sort of walking around in Seoul, let's say, I know I can read situations, right? And I know other people are reading me even when I say nothing. And to me, that is very relaxing. But if you are not from that culture, then you probably will miss, 95% of those cues. So if you're going to engage in a relationship with someone who's Japanese or Korean, at least intellectually knowing this may help you. Even though you're not going to be able to reproduce what they do, you can at least understand that that's one of the reasons for potentially the communication gap. And the other thing you have to be aware of it is, and this is something that has helped me even in my own marriage to my Korean wife. If she's yelling at me, I'm thinking that's a good sign because it means she's still thinks there's hope there, right? She's she's not only communicating through the yelling, but she's also communicating indirectly at the same time. And she's yelling at me. I'm like, okay, she still has hope. If a Japanese or Korean woman stops talking to you like that, stops yelling at you, that's when things are potentially bad because they've just decided that could be just the precursor to the ghosting, right? So you should be kind of glad if they're still yelling at you.